If you're ready to harness the power of your communications data, blast off with Nylas today.
All right, Ram. So if someone really wants to harness the power of their communications data, I think there's going to be some dates involved at some point. What do you think?
Yep, there is. Hi, everyone. Excited to get started today. And today we're going to talk about working with date and time in JavaScript. And I think for most developers, when they have to work on date and time, there's always a bit of that feeling like, oh, I have to work with date and time. But we want to kind of go through and clarify why working with date and time can be challenging and some approaches to thinking about working with date and time. So we're going to look, go ahead.
Yeah, I've gotten to spend my own fair share of time on working with date and time in the past. So this is like when you proposed both writing a blog post and then doing a live stream about this, I thought, one, super relevant for people working with Nylas and our calendar APIs because dates are obviously involved there, but also just like something that as kind of a mountain I've had to climb up myself. I had a lot of thoughts on this too, and I'm excited to talk this out with you today.
Yeah, so we're going to first jump in and just look at what's available out of the box using JavaScript and look at different formats and talk about how those different formats can be used. And we're going to touch base or just kind of showcase some libraries that are useful when working with date and time. And then we'll wrap up by using the Nylas API, grabbing a calendar event and seeing how we can actually format that information, the start and time information.
Awesome.
So let's jump in. Let me share my screen. Okay, cool. Let me just move this over here and I'm going to format this so we can share the entire screen. And for now, I'm going to start off by just using the actual browser environment. And this is one thing I'm going to call out is that JavaScript lives in many different environments. And I'm going to come back to this later on in the video. But for now, we can actually use the date object to get information about date and time. And one thing to call out here is this is actually not a format that would be readable or human readable. So if you were to present this on your application, a user wouldn't understand what this means. And this is essentially a counter of all the milliseconds up until or since January 1st, 1970. So this is known as Unix time or Universal Time Coordinated. And this is an example of a format that may be useful when you're building on an application, you need to store information. So this is one way of storing information that you can retrieve later on and use within JavaScript.
And I guess it has the benefit of being, since it's just an integer at the end of the day, pretty portable, pretty easy to pass around. So I think, like, again, one of the things, though, is that maybe this particular format might not have working for it, of course, is that within it, at least in my knowledge, it doesn't represent the time zone. So we're talking about, seconds since January 1st, 1970. And oftentimes that can be enough for you, but not always.
Yep. And one thing to call out is this is actually in milliseconds. And we'll see this when we move forward, is that Unix time is actually represented in seconds. So there's some things to keep in mind. But even if we typed in new date, this is more closer to what a format would look like if we're presenting it to the user. So when I mentioned earlier that you're going to have different formats of date and time, the reason for it is because you will have different use cases for it. So one use case will be you would want to store this information. So that would be in a different format. And you'd want to display it in another format for your users to be able to use and to work with date and time. And the other format we're going to look at, this is another format that is very common, is ISO. So this is a standard format for representing date and time, and includes much more information, such as the actual date and time, the time, and as well the time zone information. So this is also a good format that's useful for storing in your database because you can store it as a string and you can bring it out and parse it using JavaScript or modern date and time libraries that we'll look at in a few moments. So again, one thing I wanted to emphasize here is that you have JavaScript or you have date and time for multiple different use cases, one for storing information, the other one for displaying it. And another use case we'll look at towards the end is when you're communicating with any API, you may get back date and time information in another format. So let's take a look at how we can actually format this information. And we're going to use the internationalization object available in JavaScript. And how we can use the internationalization object is just by typing in internationalization. We're going to do date and time format. And we're going to pass in an actual format. And this is going to be a string. So we're going to get the English US format for a specific date and time. So here we see we get September 20th, 2022. And we can do this in other languages as well. Another example of this is if we did this in the German format, it's formatted slightly different.
I'm guessing that one, maybe I'm wrong, that's probably Great Britain.
Sorry, you're right. It's actually Great Britain.
Yeah. But either way, yeah, I mean, like it's really handy to have this. So these, I guess, like loosely, these are called locale strings, and they're standardized pretty much across any system. So if you kind of commit a few of your favorites or the most useful ones to memory, those will pretty much be, something that you can use across most systems. So typically, I've found myself using JA-JP, I think, for Japanese formats as well. So if you were to actually try that, what you would see is I think it'd be more like year/month/date. Yeah.
Yep, exactly. So this is one way that you can kind of start updating your format for the different time zone or for the different country that you're in. So we've kind of looked at using JavaScript itself to kind of represent and display different formats for date and time. And one thing that you'd be asking yourself is, why wouldn't I use an actual library? And that's something that's worth considering, using an actual third-party library or a library like Date.js. So Date.js is an alternative to Moment.js. So it's a more modern library. It's lightweight, and it gives you a lot of functionality that's built off of the actual date object from JavaScript. And one thing to consider, and I've mentioned this earlier, is that you're going to be building, if you're building functionality across different environments, such as your front end, your back end, possibly a mobile device, the actual version of JavaScript may be different. So that you can have consistency of how you format and work with date and time, it is recommended to use an actual library so that you know that you'll have parity of the functions you're using across your different environments.
Yeah, that's a really good point, because I think sometimes it's easy to conflate, what comes standard as part of the JavaScript language versus like what's more of like an agreed upon browser API, or generally agreed upon Node.js API. And sometimes especially when you're switching between those two environments, you can find that pretty quickly that the things that you're used to relying on in one place, say until recently, for example, fetch was widely supported across browsers, but not so in Node. And I think these days now, if I'm not mistaken, we're up to feature parity with fetch in Node.js as well. But for a long time, you couldn't rely on that, and you would want to pull in a library to make sure that the behavior was standard. So same idea here with dates and libraries that support dates as well.
Yeah, and another example of a library that I've used quite a bit is Date.fns. So this is also a modern JavaScript date utility library that you can use when working with dates in the different environments.
Yep. And I'll just note here, this is one that I've used in the past, and actually fairly recent past as well. One of the things I quite like about this one is that it can be pretty lightweight. It kind of gives you just a bunch of utility functions, so you can just grab the thing that you want. You've actually pulled up some code in this tab here that something I just recently wrote. If you want to swap over to that,
yep, sure,
in GitHub.
Yep.
And we won't. This code was kind of written for just a little script I wrote, so not necessarily prepped for prime time, but just to talk you through it. On line 1 here, you can see that what I'm doing is pulling in 3 different libraries. So we've got previous Friday, parse ISO and set. And if you have a look there, just in the code, we start using those methods around line 5. So all this function get start date that I wrote is doing is saying, hey, if there's a command line argument, that should be in as a string in an ISO.
I don't know if Ash is here right now. Let me just see if I can get him back. Ooh. There you go.
Oh, did I disappear?
Yeah, I think you went away for a few seconds, but
okay. Well, hopefully things will remain stable now. Okay, so do you know where I cut off?
I think we were just talking about the top one line, the first line.
Got it. Okay, so first line, right? We're just pulling in a handful of like handy dandy methods from this date FNS library. Pretty cool. Like they've got a previous Friday method, a parse ISO method, and a set method. And we'll just kind of briefly fly through this little get start date function that I wrote. So if you look at line 5, that's the first time we use one of these methods. So this function is looking to see if we have a command line argument. If we do, that argument should have been passed in as some sort of ISO string, but we need to parse that into actually something that's a little bit more fleshed out. This library will handle that. It's beautiful, right? That's like one line. I don't have to write all of this stuff to parse all the various permutations of what a user might put in as that string input, and then I'm good. But if, I'm using this ternary operator here from line 4 through 6, so if there's no command line argument, then I'm using the set function, and it's wrapped around a previous Friday call and a new day call. So let's unpack that. If you call new date in JavaScript, what you're going to get is the exact moment in time that you called or that you instantiated that object, which is great, except I just want that date to be, all of the hours, minutes, seconds, and milliseconds stripped out of it. I don't need that level of fidelity. And as a matter of fact, it'll be problematic for this given script. So what I'm doing is taking that new date and saying, hey, date functions, date FNS, give me the previous Friday. Whatever the Friday was before the moment I called this, I want that. And then the set function that we're wrapping around that is stripping out the hours, minutes, seconds, and milliseconds. I'm setting them all back to 0. So basically, this get start date function, I'm saying if I have input from the user, I want to parse that into an ISO format and return that to the script. Or if I don't have that command line input from the user, then instead, just give me the previous Friday at midnight. So, and then that gets returned back into the program. So you can kind of see here how like just something like this date FNS library is really just it's kind of like a Swiss Army knife of cool things that you can do that would be pretty annoying to write yourself.
Yeah, this is awesome. And I really like that with date FNS, you can pull out the functionality that you need and to calculate stuff like, oh, what's the previous Friday, the amount of code that you'd have to do that by yourself compared to just using a library that does that for you consistently. It's really powerful. So we took a look at using or just modern JavaScript or modern JavaScript date libraries. Now what I want to do is kind of look at what's available using the Nylas CLI. So I want to work through an example of using the Nylas CLI to grab a calendar, then a calendar event. So I'm just going to go over to the terminal. And in the terminal, so we have access to the Nylas API or its Nylas CLI, and it's available anytime you sign up for Nylas or want to build with Nylas. So as long as you have an account, you can access the Nylas API. And what we're going to do now is we're going to grab one calendar. So we're going to look through and just grab one calendar. So I've typed in Nylas API. We're going to make a GET request to the calendars endpoint. And we're only going to ask for the first calendar that's out of a list of many. So we're just asking to get one calendar returned back to us. And we're going to get back JSON, a JSON of a list of calendars. But in this case, we have one calendar. And here, we're going to grab the ID. And what we're going to do with this is we're going to make another call to the Nylas API. And we're doing this all through our terminal, is we're going to grab a specific event. I'm going to type in Nylas API events, and we're going to get one event. And we have to pass in the calendar ID. And one thing to keep in mind is I'm going to add starts after so that we can get an event that starts after the present moment. So I'm just going to go back to the browser. I'm going to calculate this Unix time that is in seconds. So in the browser, we're going to do date.now. And this value that's returned is actually in milliseconds. So we need to convert this to seconds. I'm just going to round down the seconds. Round down the seconds so that I get this value that I'm going to pass into the Nylas API. So now that I have this value, I'm going to do starts after. So I'm looking for one calendar event that starts after the present moment. And it's always useful to use a value starts after that's in the future so you can see upcoming calendar events. And we're going to get back an actual full JSON of all the information for that calendar event. And the one thing we're particularly interested in is actually the starts and end time. So I'm going to grab this information and we're going to jump back into the actual browser environment. So here we have this information. I'm just going to create two variables. So I'm going to do end time. Let's call it end time in seconds. It's going to equal this value.
By the way, you've got in sections, not in seconds there.
Seconds. End time in seconds. It's always hard to name a variable. Imagine it doing it in live stream. So we're going to do start time in seconds as well. So start time in seconds. And we're just going to grab this value. So we have two values, the start time and end time in seconds. And one thing to keep in mind is when we need to work with this information in JavaScript, we actually need to convert it to milliseconds. So this is one thing to keep in mind when you're communicating with an API, is that you may get back a different format that you need to work with. So we're going to create the start time. And it's going to be new date. And we're going to pass in the start time in seconds. And we're going to multiply this by 1,000 so that it's converted to milliseconds for us. We're going to do the same thing for end time. We're going to do new date, and it's going to be end time in seconds. And we're going to times it by 1,000 so that we get milliseconds. So we have two variables for the start time and end time. And let's try converting this to a different time zone. So for example, if I want to get the start time in the actual West Coast time, or if I were to be in Vancouver, Canada, what would the start time be? So I would do start time, and this is one way to go about doing it. We'll get the local string, and we're going to pass in the format, which we've seen before. So this is going to be English US, and we're going to pass in a time zone. So these are additional options that we can pass in. And the time zone that we pass in is going to be a standard format, and there's actually a database of all different time zones that we can use. And I'm just taking a look at it out on Wikipedia. And if I want to find what's the time zone format for Vancouver, it's going to be America/Vancouver. Let's bring this over to the console. And now we see that we get the start time. So it's going to be September 22nd, and it gives us a start time of 11:30 a.m. And if we wanted to get the start time in Toronto, for example, we would do America Toronto, and it would show us the start time at 2:30 p.m.
Wow, that is so handy.
So this is a great way. We've kind of walked through getting information from Nylas in a different format. So it was in seconds. We converted it to milliseconds, and then we converted it to a format that's actually readable so we can display to the user.
Very cool. Yeah, so I mean, some of these, there's just a lot of options out there, and there won't be just a single right answer for every application or every given need. But given the flexibility that developers have with a handful of libraries, as well as like native browser APIs and certain options inside of Node.js as well, there's just a lot of really cool stuff to work with. And if developers want to get more information just generally on working with time zones in JavaScript, you've actually written the blog post, which is hilariously long, the URL in this, but let me read this out real quick. It's nylus.com/blog/how to handle time zones with JavaScript. ram-dev. So there's a lot of words to type there, but you can also Google it. And inside of the blog post, Ram actually goes through and first just talks about generally JavaScript the way that we did today, and shows, I think you listed up 4 different libraries that developers can grab. And then it goes on to talk about, in the context of working with Nylas, using our CLI just the way you just did, and the calendar API, some things that you can do there to work with time zones.
So definitely an interesting and fun topic for any developer working with different time zones, especially in JavaScript. So have a look at the blog. And one more thing is we always have upcoming videos. So definitely take a look at our YouTube channel. Feel free to subscribe and follow along. We'd love to share more with you about development, building with Nylas, and all fun things.
Yeah, absolutely. We do these twice a week. And in addition to that, we publish a couple of blog posts a week. And as we go, we're often publishing sample repos to our GitHub organization. So there's a lot of stuff out there. We're always making more. At the same time, if you have anything that you want, if you're watching this and you say, hey, I want to learn how to do X, Y, and Z with Nylas, or maybe just in general, we're more than happy to take that on. So feel free to leave a comment, reach out, and let us know what you need.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone.
All right. Thank you, everybody. Thanks for watching. Thanks, Ram.
See you.